The Crustaceans of Cromer, Book 1, The Flint Echo. The salt was the first thing Barnaby smelled every morning, but today it carried the metallic tang of old copper. A man of few words and calloused palms, Barnaby had spent 30 years mending nets, his identity tied to the simple, sturdy geometry of the pier. But for Barnaby, the world had gone silent 6 weeks ago. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a physical weight in his chest, a hollow space where the laughter of his daughters used to reside. 6 weeks had passed since Eliza and Mary had gone to the base of Beast and Bump to gather fossils in the crumbling cliffs. Eliza was the dreamer who sketched gulls in the margins of her ledgers. Mary was the practical one who could untangle a line faster than any man. 6 weeks since their empty skiff had washed up on the shingle, dry on the inside as if they had simply evaporated into the Norfolk mist. "They're gone, Barnaby," a voice rasped. It was Silas, an old longshoreman whose skin looked like cured leather, etched with the salt maps of 1,000 storms. He leaned against a piling, puffing on a pipe that smelled of sweet cherry and rot. Silas was the town's living memory, a man who believed the sea was not a resource, but a landlord demanding rent. The North Sea took her due. Don't go looking for change in a beggar's bowl. Barnaby didn't turn. He was staring at the chalk reef offshore. The water there didn't move like the rest of the tide, it simmered. "I saw them last night, Silas. Standing in the surf below the gangway. They didn't scream. They just stared. And their eyes, Silas, they were glowing red." Silas spat into the water and hurried away, crossing himself. He knew the old Norfolk stories his own father had whispered to keep him away from the tide pools at night. When the dead come back to the shallows, they are coming back as bait. In the days after, the town of Cromer didn't just feel cold, it felt watched. The wind off the North Sea began to carry a new sound, not the roar of waves, but a high-pitched, rhythmic clicking that seemed to come from inside the walls of the Flint cottages. Silas spent his nights sitting by the lifeboat house, his gnarled hands trembling as he carved small wooden dolls and threw them into the tide. He wasn't just performing a ritual, he was paying a debt for a secret he'd kept since the storm of '82. "One for the girl who walks," he'd mutter. "One for the girl who swims. One for the thing that wears their skin." Barnaby spent those nights in a fever, his skin breaking out in strange, salt-crusted rashes that felt like tiny teeth under the surface. He dreamt of the chalk reef, but in his dreams, it wasn't rock. It was a giant, sleeping lung, breathing in sync with the town's own gasping lungs. That night, the fog rolled in off the sea like a shroud, smelling of rotting kelp. Barnaby pushed his small, flat-bottomed dory into the black water. He rowed toward the reef, guided by a light that shouldn't have been there. 100 yards out, he saw them. 2 pale figures rose from the waist up out of the water. They were perfectly still, unaffected by the swell. Their skin was the color of a fish's belly. As Barnaby drew closer, the girls turned their heads in a slow, synchronized jerk. "Eliza? Mary?" His voice was a pathetic whimper. The figures opened their mouths. Their jaws dropped unnaturally low, forming dark, bottomless voids. And then, the light began. Deep within their sockets, a rhythmic crimson pulse flickered, thump flash, like the heartbeat of a dying star. Barnaby reached for his lantern, his hands shaking so violently the oil sloshed. As the light spilled across the water, he saw the horror. It wasn't flesh, but hard, segmented chitin covered in tiny, vibrating sensory hairs. The hair was a mass of fine yellow filaments. Beneath them, a massive curved shadow shifted, a shell wide as a carriage, encrusted with the skulls of the drowned. The water didn't splash, it inhaled. One of the daughters leaned forward, its segmented neck extending with a wet, clicking sound. A jagged, multi-jointed limb, thick as a tree trunk, and ending in a hook of blackened obsidian, slammed onto the gunwale. The boat capsized. Barnaby was thrown into the freezing North Sea. Salt burned his eyes, but through the dark he saw the underworld. A forest of human ribs, littering the white chalk floor. He kicked toward the shore, his lungs screaming. He could feel the vibration of the beast behind him, the thump-thump of massive legs striking the reef in pursuit. He swam for the gangway. the sloping path to the town. His fingers struck the flint-heavy shingle. He dragged himself out, crawling until his hands hit the dry grass of the dunes. Behind him, the red light lingered at the water's edge before sinking back into the black. Book 2, The Biological Cost. It's a bit large for a decapod, isn't it? A shadow fell over him. Standing there was a man in a long oilskin coat, smelling of formaldehyde and ozone. This was Dr. Aris Thorne, a disgraced naturalist who had been chased out of London for suggesting that nature wasn't a clockwork machine, but a hungry, adaptive predator. One eye was a dull, milky blue. The other was made of polished glass, which seemed to see things the human eye could not. "I am Dr. Aris Thorne," the man said, plucking a translucent flake of shell from Barnaby's sweater with clinical precision. "It isn't wearing them, Mr. Barnaby. It is becoming them." Aggressive mimicry. It consumes the prey, breaks down the genetic memory, and extrudes a lure. It isn't hunting for meat anymore. It's hunting for the grief that brings the meat to the water's edge. "Come with me," said Thorne, his voice devoid of pity but full of a terrifying curiosity. "I need to show you something." Thorne's workshop was a salt-stained shack hidden near the Runton Cliffs, a place where the line between science and nightmare blurred. Thorne gestured to a tank where a juvenile Cromer mimic scurried. From its back grew a tiny, fleshy growth resembling a human finger. Thorne watched it with a fatherly, yet detached pride. "They start small," Thorne whispered, "but as they grow, they mimic needs. The red glow is the optic nerve of the host. The crab uses those poor daughters of yours as its eyes." He leaned in closer, his glass eye catching the moonlight. "The red light isn't just a bulb, Barnaby. It's a bioluminescent nerve cluster. It pulses at the exact frequency of a human heart under duress. It's a dinner bell for your soul." Thorne tapped the glass of the specimen tank. "Nature has a way of twisting itself when the soil, or the sea, gets a taste for something it shouldn't. This isn't the first unnatural growth I've tracked through Norfolk this year." He paused, reaching into a jar and pulling out a dried, violet-stained scrap of wood. It didn't look rotten. It looked colonized, the grain of the wood replaced by a hexagonal crystalline structure. He forced Barnaby to look through a brass microscope at a slide of Mary's dress, the scrap found on the shingle. "Look at the fibers," Thorne whispered. Under the lens, the cotton wasn't rotting. It was being rewoven. Tiny, translucent cilia were knitting the fabric into something biological. The dress wasn't a garment anymore. It was an organ. "It's not just the girls, Barnaby. The creature is mapping us. It studies how we love, how we mourn, and how we build. It's building a Cromer of its own beneath the waves. I spent 3 weeks in Little Melton back in the spring," Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a low, haunted register. "There's a growth there, a mushroom, that doesn't just eat the forest, it replaces it. It mimics the very air to hide its scale. Up here, the sea uses your daughters' faces to lure you in. Down there, the land uses the smell of home to make you lay down and die. Different methods, Barnaby, but the same result. We are no longer the masters of the landscape." Book 3, The Council of Silence. At the town hall, Barnaby slammed the piece of black chitin onto the oak table. Mayor Halloway, a man with a neck like a bull and eyes like polished pebbles, looked annoyed. Halloway wasn't a villain in his own mind. He was a pragmatist. To him, the town was a machine that required fuel, and sometimes that fuel was blood. "We all know the North Sea is dangerous, Barnaby. You're seeing ghosts." Thorne stepped forward, his glass eye reflecting the dim candlelight. "A decapod mimic. If you don't close the harbor, you're providing a buffet." Halloway leaned forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow. "Cromer lives on the crab trade. We close the harbor, we starve, we don't chase monsters, we endure them." As they left, Barnaby noticed Halloway's ring had a stone that looked exactly like the red glowing lens from the water. That evening, Barnaby followed Halloway to a secret cove. He watched as the mayor threw a burlap sack containing a living goat into the water. The black claws rose, but they didn't attack Halloway. The 2 pale daughters emerged from the foam. Another month, Holloway whispered to the lures, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and reverence. Keep the reef calm for another month. The horror wasn't just the beast, it was the deal. The town was sacrificing its own to keep the fishing waters peaceful. The mayor didn't see the lures as his citizens, he saw them as a tax paid to a hungry god. Barnaby ran back to Thorne's lab, but the door was kicked in. Thorne was slumped in the corner, his glass eye missing and a jagged wound across his chest. He looked less like a man and more like a specimen himself. They knew, Thorne wheezed. The village, they're protecting the mother. She's in the deep trench. You have to kill the source, or Cromer will never be free. Using Thorne's blueprints, schematics that looked more like occult diagrams than engineering, Barnaby reinforced an old salvage bell in a sea cave. He worked with a cold, mechanical fury, welding seams as if he were sealing his own coffin. Standing on the wet sand were Eliza and Mary. "Papa," a voice said. Eliza's voice, but sounding like a cracked record, the syllables overlapping in a sickening loop. "Come, swim with us." Barnaby didn't cry. He felt cold iron settle in his chest. "I'm coming," he whispered. "But I'm not swimming." He hit the release lever. The bell plunged into the black maw of the North Sea. Book 4, The Anatomy of Horror. The bell groaned as the pressure mounted. The descent felt eternal, the water outside turning from a murky green to a suffocating bruised indigo. The pressure began to play tricks on his memory. He didn't just hear Eliza's voice, he felt her presence in the small, cramped space, as if she were sitting right behind him. The condensation on the porthole ran in patterns that looked like the handwriting in her schoolbooks, lists of groceries and half-finished poems. Outside, the forest of human ribs was more than a graveyard, it was a library. Each set of bones was etched with bioluminescent runes, a record of every soul the mother had processed. Barnaby read Thorne's journal, the ink smeared by salt. The mimic stores the spinal fluid of victims, using their nerve endings to bridge the gap between shell and lure. It steals the nervous system. The bell landed on the seafloor with a bone-jarring thud. Barnaby turned on the floodlights. The ground wasn't sand, it was a carpet of white bones. In the center stood dozens of lures, men, women, and children, swaying in the current like morbid seaweed, tethered to the seabed by umbilical stalks. He recognized Old Man Gurney, who had vanished in '82, his face now a mask of translucent wax, his eyes glowing that same rhythmic, terrible red. He saw a lure that wasn't finished, a half-formed shape of a dog that had gone missing a year ago. It wagged a tail made of stiff, black coral. The mother was a lonely god, trying to reconstruct a world she didn't understand. Barnaby watched a lure that looked like the town priest. Its mouth opened, and a bubble escaped. The lures were being used as bellows to pump oxygen down into the hive. Suddenly, a massive claw, larger than the bell, swept through the light. The mother was awake. Barnaby donned his canvas and lead pressure suit. He had to plant the heart stopper, a chemical Thorne had designed to calcify the creature's organs from the inside out. As he stepped onto the bone-strewn floor, every lure in the garden turned its head toward him. The movement was silent and simultaneous, 100 red eyes locking onto his heat signature. His air hose began to vibrate. "Papa, it's cold," Mary's voice whispered inside his helmet. The creature was tapping into the metal of the suit, using it as a sounding board to break his will. He ignored the voice, though it tore at his heart like a hook. He found the primary intake valve, a pulsing, fleshy orifice. As he primed the charge, his hand brushed a lure. It turned, and for a second, the red light flickered out, replaced by a hauntingly human blue. "Help me," it mouthed. The thought that his daughter's true spirit could still be inside nearly broke him. But the lead boots kept him grounded. Back on the surface, Holloway and his men took a boat out to the buoy. "Cut the line," Holloway ordered, his face set in a grim mask of necessary evil. "If he wants to be with his daughters, let him stay there." The air stopped flowing. Barnaby had 15 minutes of oxygen left. He looked up. The silhouette of the diving bell was drifting away. He was stranded at the bottom of the world. The ground heaved. The mother wasn't under the rocks. She was the rocks. A massive eye, 10 feet across, opened beneath him. The lures began to scream, a collective, piercing shriek that shattered Barnaby's gauges. With blurring vision, Barnaby crawled toward the neural cluster. He saw the ghosts of everyone eaten, preserved like flies in amber. He saw Eliza. He saw Mary. He jammed the chemical spike into the center of the mass. The mother let out a low vibration that rattled Barnaby's teeth. He was caught on a massive barnacle on the back of the creature as it began a frantic climb toward the surface. As his mind wandered from CO2 poisoning, he saw the lures change. They were no longer frozen. The heart-stopper was severing the mother's control. The lures began to weep, real saltwater tears. Barnaby found a gas pocket under the corner of the beast's shell that overhung and created air from decaying organic matter that resided there. He shoved his helmet into the sulfurous pocket. The area was colossal, and around him were the crushed hulls of a century of Norfolk fishing boats. Among the wrecks he found the archivist, a skeletal figure fused to a captain's chair by coral. He spoke in clicks, his mind merged with the hive. The archivist showed him that the mother was a terraformer. She used the bones to reinforce the coastline. Cromer existed only because she allowed it. If she died, the soft clay cliffs of Norfolk would slide into the sea. Barnaby realized the terrible truth. To save the town's soul, he would have to destroy its home. The chemical was severing the neural link. The Eliza and Mary lures began to move independently, looking at their own clawed hands with horror. They had autonomy, but they were still trapped in monsters' bodies. The mother reached the shelf where light penetrated. The pressure change was violent. Barnaby, now clinging to her back, saw the hulls of the Cromer fleet above. On the pier, Holloway stood with a ceremonial harpoon ready for the welcoming, a ritual sacrifice of orphans to ensure calm seas. The water in the harbor rose in a massive dome. The mother's head broke the surface. Then, the lures emerged, hundreds of lost loved ones rising from the foam. Barnaby crawled onto the pier, standing between the mare and the children. The Eliza lure looked at him, her eyes dimming. "Papa," she whispered. Barnaby held the detonator. "Press it, and the town falls. Don't, and the sacrifice continues." A woman named Martha fell to her knees as a lure looking like her lost son approached. "Tommy," she breathed. Because of the poison, the lures were experiencing a flickering consciousness. "Don't touch them," Holloway roared. "These are not your children. Back away, or the mother takes us all." He knew if the villagers recognized the humanity, his power was gone. Martha embraced the Tommy lure. But the mother's nervous system spiked. The lure's chitinous arms involuntarily tightened, snapping Martha's ribs. The illusion shattered. The scream acted as a catalyst. The mother went into a defensive frenzy. The villagers, seeing Martha crushed, turned into a mob with gutting knives and gaff hooks. Book 5, The Siege of the Pier. Barnaby saw the Eliza lure shielding the Mary lure from a spear. Thorne was right. The creature stole memories, but it had accidentally preserved their souls. "Stop!" Barnaby yelled. "Help them!" The mother's legs slammed onto the pier, snapping the Victorian ironwork. The iron groaned and twisted, like pulled sugar. The ground beneath the town started to liquefy. The massive underwater landslide had begun. Thorne emerged from the wreckage, a half-lure fused to a shell, his glass eye replaced by a red orb. "Barnaby, she's dying. The chemical is a necrotic agent." His voice was a dual tone, half human and half clicking crustacean. The mother turned a sickly gray, her shell flaking off in chunks. She began to release toxic spores, a final scorched earth defense. Barnaby cut the ropes, holding the orphans. "Run to the hills, don't look back." Holloway raised his harpoon. "You ruined it, Barnaby. You killed the peace." With a roar, the Cromer cliffs gave way. The pier and Holloway were sucked into the vortex. Barnaby felt the wood vanish. He fell into the black water, but two pairs of cold, pale hands grabbed him. Barnaby was pulled under by his heavy suit, but Eliza and Mary swam with monstrous strength, cutting through the silt. They moved with a grace their human bodies never possessed, their chitinous limbs slicing through the debris of the collapsing town. The mother emitted a mournful, low hum, The red light in every lure began to fade to amber. The hive mind was fracturing. Beneath the waves, Holloway reached out to a lure shaped like his wife. It just watched him with amber eyes until the silt swallowed them both. The lures dragged Barnaby to the pebbled beach. They collapsed, their skin beginning to crack and harden. Barnaby tore off his helmet. "Papa," Eliza whispered. Her voice was no longer a record. It was a soft, fading breath. By morning, the mother was a mountainous corpse in the bay. 3/4 of Cromer had been swept into the sea. The survivors stood on the high ground, looking at a wild, honest North Sea. The lures were turning into statues of white calcium and pearl. Barnaby spent the day telling them stories of their childhood, hoping they could hear him behind the hardening shells. He sat between Eliza and Mary, watching the iridescent shimmer of the pearl climb up their necks, sealing them into an eternal peaceful pose. The villagers moved inland. They saw hundreds of white statues standing in the shallows, a garden of stone. "Live for us," Mary's statue whispered as the jaw fused shut. Barnaby kissed their pearlescent foreheads. He took a single red fragment of an eye from both of his daughters and put them in his pocket. Barnaby walked away from the sea. He found the orphans under a stand of pines. He realized he was now the guardian of what remained. Years later, a new village was built. Children were told stories of a man who went into the dark for the truth. Barnaby sat on his porch with the red rubies from his daughter's eyes. Beside him on each side stood 2 beautiful statues. He would spend his days speaking to them with a sorrow in his heart, never again hearing the joyful laughter from their lips. Yet they provided a comfort that kept his heart beating, monuments to the love he once had. As he was dreaming of those sunny days with his girls playing on the rocky sand, a sound broke him out of his trance. He heard a faint, rhythmic thump flash coming from the water. It sounded deep within the waves. As the sound grew louder and louder, he reached down beside him and pulled out a pump-action shotgun. As he pumped the first shell into its chamber, Barnaby rasped through his gritted teeth the words, "Fuck me, not this old bollocks again."